and start the recording. So just folks on the line, if you feel like you have to take copious notes, you don't. We will make sure we send out this recording after this call. So here's the agenda for today. We went through introductions, and we'll just go high level with Azure and DR plans. And then we'll go a little bit deeper into each of the services and go through use cases, how each solution works to build out both the backup and disaster recovery plan in Azure. And we'll walk you through just how it's priced and managed. Hopefully, most of the time today we'll be going through the Azure portal and checking out some of the cool demos Manuel has. But if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the IM window, speak up, or we have some time for Q&A at the end of the time too. So again, we can go ahead and get started. We'll send over these slides and recording, and don't be afraid to speak up. Manuel or Josh, anything else to add before we kick it off?
Nope, sounds good. Thanks, Sheila.
Go ahead, Sheila.
All right, wonderful. So we'll just take a couple minutes, level set on what is Azure, what is cloud, just because we tend to use cloud and Azure for everything in Microsoft. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And why we're really having this conversation is just because over the last couple of years, we've seen a huge growth in the use of the public cloud. And while a lot of the growth came from larger orgs or just startups, we've seen a lot of the new growth come from the public sector and education specifically. So that caused us to take a step back and ask, why are all these schools looking at Azure and cloud at such a fierce rate? And the reason why is these three drivers you're seeing right now. The first is speed. So with minutes instead of days or weeks to procure and provision servers and storage, we see this huge increase in pace of innovation. So that means you get this reduced time to develop and time to market. There's also scale. So cloud gives you an almost infinite set of computing resources. Your applications can get massive global scale, and you can scale up or down depending on demand. So that means you never have to worry about running out of capacity or over provisioning. That also helps you meet peak demand without buying powerful servers or storage that you might only need for a couple of times in the year, such as registration open and close, final grade posting day, or that Monday morning start of classes when everyone logs in at once. That leads to economics. So you're only paying for what you use in the cloud, and that in itself saves you a lot of money for any app that has variable computing needs. And for some of you, there might be that additional benefit of changing CapEx to OpEx, which frees you up from maybe any of those infrastructure investments that can be put to other uses. So for example, during low traffic times at night or during holidays, you can easily scale down and therefore lower cost. On the flip side, if you need more storage, you can spin it up much faster than actually having to buy, install, and configure hardware. But on-premise, you'd have to pay for that additional TCO, whether you're using that or not. That's where Azure comes into play. And over the past couple of years, we've really started to develop Azure as our cloud computing platform and infrastructure for building, deploying, and just managing applications and services through that global network of data centers across the world. And while we've been working on this huge infrastructure to help us grow our services at scale, we've been also making sure that we know where to have these smart investments to deliver any service in a very resilient and reliable fashion. So we put our data centers around the world. We make sure that they're managed by the right people, so they're always up and always on. And we give you the options on where you want to store your data, whether you need it in multiple locations or whether you just need it in one location to give you that peace of mind that your data is always safe. And in a very literal sense, this is what Azure looks like. Huge data center out, and it's almost like a computer for rent. Very similar to your own servers and IT hardware, but usually your own hardware that has to be bought, set up, secured, and maintained, which could take up space, and by the virtue of being on-premise, is vulnerable to disasters such as power outages and floods, is now Microsoft's to deal with. So you can see this image shows pods with racks and motherboards, all with electricity and network connections plugged in, all probably in a remote place close to an internet truck line where power is constantly supplied. And these are always updated if any pods need to be sealed or delivered by truck or slotted as replacements. Those upgrades and increased capacity is taken care of right away. And the one thing that always comes to mind, especially in education, is compliance. So as you can see, while the slide is pulling up, we have examples of compliance both across enterprise and across different types of ISO standards. So probably the type of standards you'd expect to see from Microsoft and just any vendor in general. But we're also doing a lot of work around these types of verticals. So healthcare, and also just overall in education and just work around the world. So with these compliance standards, it's easier for you to fulfill your own obligations across global, regulatory, or just industry standards. And just to be clear, you'll still own most of this work to keep your systems compliant, but we have the platform and the capabilities so you can decide whether or not to use them. So you can decide whether you want to encrypt a virtual disk or choose not to. And Josh, I'm fairly new to the New York area, so are there any New York State contract compliance information that the folks on the line should be aware of?
Yep, so Azure was the first and I believe the only cloud-approved OGS, cloud-approved by the Office for General Services in New York State. If you guys haven't worked on the purchasing side, in New York State, it's easiest to use OGS-approved vendors because it meets all the compliance regulations. And as Sheila just pointed out, there's quite a few that Azure checks off the list. So that's very well received by New York State. And we can also talk, there's a number of customers within the SUNY system that already leverage Azure at a pretty decent scale. So go ahead.
Great, good to know. And just like Josh mentioned, we have different customers along that different stage of journey within Azure. So whether you're new to Azure or whether you're pretty deep, most folks are leveraging Azure for backup, disaster recovery, or just running machines in Azure. Those type of workloads are fairly standard. So I like to bring this slide up before I go into backup and DR, because with Azure, it's very easy to go granular with a specific project, but you'll want to just big picture your overall strategy as well. And on the slide, you can tell we have a really broad platform to work with from both the infrastructure and platform perspective, and those work together to essentially give you building blocks or solutions, like this slide mentions. So I actually used to show a different slide that had all of our products listed by name, and that wasn't really helpful and probably was more confusing than anything. So really what we want to say is we'll help you find out your solution. Just make sure to big picture it as well, come up with a strategy, and we'll help you go deeper from there. Today we'll be focusing on that box in the bottom left corner, which is backup and disaster recovery. But if there's another pain point or cloud opportunity you're seeing on campus, if it's big data or analytics or just getting started with dev test, let us know. You're just not limited to the conversations we are having today. And with that said, before I jump into backup and disaster recovery, any questions so far just about Azure in general or about security or privacy or trust?
And feel free to either come off mute, or if you prefer, if you're shy and you want to ask in the IM window, go ahead. Sheila and I and Josh are watching the IM window as well.
Yeah. All right. I will take that silence as a no, but we are keeping an eye on the IM window. And so again, we'll go through the different BC and DR scenarios, but I also just like to set expectations and say disaster recovery is important in any part of the IT strategy, but you'll want to make sure that you know where to use each type of solution, especially since I think over the last couple of years, security breaches and network outages have becoming very common threats in education. So in the beginning stages of DR, we usually have people approach us thinking that backup is just enough for a full-on business continuity and disaster recovery plan. Or they think that they have a plan for backing up their data, they don't really need to do anything else. And while that's important, it's not the same as having an all-encompassing plan. It is, however, the beginning stage of it. So we'll go through the different stages between, let's say, running something 24/7 in Azure, or backing up a workload into Azure, or just having an overall DR plan. But while we're walking through these components, just know that these aren't either or scenarios. You'll probably be using a combination of both Azure Backup, Azure Site Recovery, or even a couple of other services and storages. So just know we'll be going through these solutions, but it'll probably be a mix of all three. And we'll kick it off with storage. There's a couple of really good use cases for this, especially within education. And by the way, you'll see 5 use cases here, and there's more than what's listed on the slide because schools are always facing challenges related to data storage and management. We'll mostly be focusing on point 5 for backup and recovery, but not a bad idea to start thinking about the type of data you have and where you're housing it and start asking yourself, are you seeing an explosion of data growth? Or is your team constantly running out of space or having to manually archive old data or acquire new hardware? And questions like these are important, especially since your data volume is only going to grow from, let's say, recorded classes dependent on class size or large research initiatives. So just housing massive amounts of student data. The benefit of the cloud is that it'll be easier for you to be agile to support new workloads or just manage the storage sprawl that you guys are probably seeing. And this is where Azure Storage comes into play. So with this, there's a couple of ways to take advantage of our product, what we call Azure Storage. And one thing I'll note here is that you'll see us use the term hybrid a bunch, but for Azure Storage, one of the reasons why we say we're hybrid is because we also just work really well with our partners. So I like to mention that even though it's Microsoft Team, Microsoft Azure, if you have a third-party provider, let's say a Commvault or a Veeam or a NetApp or someone else, that's perfectly fine. We love working with our partners, and most third-party backup and DR providers do support backup and archiving directly to Azure. And you can use Azure as your primary or secondary storage for that. So when we say hybrid, again, that could mean different things, but know that if you're doing something on-prem, this really will be an extension to Azure, not necessarily a rip and replace, unless you want to do that. And again, just with Azure Storage, your data is always going to be stored securely. It's going to be encrypted, you control the keys, and all of the data is guaranteed to be within your realm of access. And even if we could access the data, you still would control the keys. So all we would get is a bunch of useless encrypted data. And by the way, all your data is also guaranteed to stay within the United States, unless you purposely say you want it to go into another data center. So again, even though you still own a lot of the work to make your systems compliant, we want to make sure no matter what, that the storage we provide in Azure is also meeting up-to-date industry standards, is reliable, and also you just have different ways of accessing it. And hopefully the different trends of just needing a safe and secure spot to host your data is relevant, but we'll just cover off on the different aspects on how to price this out before turning it over to a demo. And the reason why we just go through pricing this out is because, one, it's definitely a frequently common question we get, but also two, it also showcases the different ways you can customize Azure Storage. And outside of just how much storage you're deciding to use, there's really three big things that's going to change your cost. The first is the type of storage you choose. So most of the times it's going to be probably blob data. Think static content like archives or video and so on. Data that you reference a bunch, but you probably won't change too often. Then there's page blobs, or what we now reference as disks if you need storage for virtual machines. And going beyond that, usually with disks and block blobs, that covers it off. But if you need storage, let's say, for massive amounts of scalable data, like app user data or address book or device info, we have something called table storage. Or if you need maybe types of storage for reliable messaging at scale, like if maybe a web server isn't constantly bogged down waiting for requests to be processed, we also have queue storage. So whatever type of storage you need to get into Azure, that's going to affect your pricing, but we all have a different type of variety you can use. And the good thing about that is that they also all come with built-in redundancy. So when we say redundancy, the base level you get is locally redundant, which is 3 replicas of data within a single zone or facility in a single region, and that provides data durability for your disk or node or rack failures. The second is usually geo-redundant. So if you need extra redundancy, you get 6 copies of your data across 2 regions. That's helpful to protect data against a regional disaster, let's say a tornado or a hurricane or snowstorm and so on. And there's also different types of redundancy, such as zone redundant, which is where if you need to span different zones or different facilities, or if you just need a read access copy of everything. And finally, the thing that's going to affect your pricing is going to be your tier. So with tiering, that means you would take a look at your data and figure out, are you going to access it a bunch, or are you just keeping it around for compliance reasons? So if you are actually going to be accessing your storage a whole lot, or you think you would frequently need to be accessing it over a short period of time, that's a great use case for hot storage. If, let's say, you really do need it just for compliance, you're not going to be accessing it, probably be cooler. What we now have is archival. So most of the times you'll see with between hot and cool storage, there is a big pricing difference in actually just storing that data. With hot, it's going to be more expensive to store, but there's no cost to actually retrieve that data. However, the moment you soon start to go to cooler archive, cost for storage is actually pretty low. But if you want to access it, that's when you start seeing retrieval costs. So while Manuel is going through a demo of what type of storage do you want to use for a different scenario, just know that the type of storage you use, the type of redundancy you decide, and the access tier is all going to determine how that pricing output is going to be done. So Manuel, I'm going to hand it back to you. Do you want to go through a demo or scenario of Azure Storage for folks?
Excellent. I'll go ahead and bring that up here. And are there questions as we kind of get towards the demo section? And so what I've got here is I've got some storage accounts, and I can create a storage account. Let me step through what that looks like. So if I go create a resource, I'm in the Azure portal here. I've hit the green button for create a resource. And if I want to create storage, I've got a couple different things. I can search for storage, or I can just choose the storage section. And then here we have an option for a storage account, right? So let's go ahead and create a storage account. And if I create a storage account, I just want to point out a couple of things. You'll notice that I need to create a unique storage account name. Now, this can't be, for example, storage, because somebody's already used storage. The idea here is that our storage accounts have a REST API accessible endpoint that allows the programmatic type of access that Sheila was talking about. For example, websites, third-party applications. Imagine if you want to hook up Commvault or Backup Exec or Veeam or NetBackup to Azure Storage, this is how those third-party products would communicate with the storage account. And so it does have to be unique. So let's say, let's see if this is unique. Okay, good. Looks like nobody's used Storage Kuni. Okay, cool. So then what kind of storage account do we want to create? Storage V2, the general purpose V2 account is the latest type. Do I want standard storage, which is going to be disk, or do I need premium storage, which is going to be SSD? So we'll take spinning disk because we're talking in the context now about backups, right? And so the other question that we talk about is redundancy, right? Do you want locally redundant storage, or do you require geo-redundant storage or read access geo-redundant storage, where that other 3 copies in the remote region are read accessible? In the particular case for backup, for most of my education customers, the great majority, they look at cloud backups to Azure with triplicate copies in a single region as way better than what they have today, and they don't necessarily need multi-geo redundancy. Think like, US East Coast and US West Coast for their backup data. Obviously, GRS nearly doubles the cost because it's 6 copies of the data instead of 3. Okay, so the default access tier will be hot. And then the other thing to point out, for example, is you can require that, because the REST API can be accessed over HTTP or HTTPS. Those of you that have sensitive data you're storing, you can actually enable the requirement that only HTTPS and TLS secured transport protocols will ever be used to access the storage. That's pretty cool. And of course, if you have multiple subscriptions, you pick the subscription. All resources in Azure need to exist in a resource group, so I'll go ahead and use an existing resource group, and I'll pick one of my, you can see I've got several different resource groups. I'll pick out one of my resource groups I've been using recently. And then the other important thing to notice is, reinforcing the point that you're in control of where your data sits, is where in the world do I want this storage account to exist, right? And as we mentioned, Sheila pointed out, we've got many, many different locations. I can drop this data in Korea South if I like. Probably doesn't make sense for a backup from New York, right? So I might choose US East or US East 2. Those are both Virginia area locations, right? If I've got concerns about going more out of region than Virginia as compared to New York, then I can maybe choose South Central US, for example. So in this particular case, I'll just say South Central US. And I'll go ahead and create that. So I'll pin this to the dashboard and go ahead and create that. And so you'll see this doesn't take very long to create the account. What I'm paying for here is nothing, because a storage account has no cost associated with it until you start writing data to it. And so just know that this is essentially a container which can contain my data, and the billing doesn't start until I start using it. So creating storage accounts doesn't cost anything. Using storage accounts does carry costs with it. So to kind of go through what that looks like, I've got actually I can jump into a storage account to give you an idea of the tiering. And I think this is very important because this is a differentiator for us and our competition out there. So if I go out here to and you can see the storage account was already created. I'm going to go to a storage account that I created earlier and drop some data into so I can demo easier. And so I've got this storage account. And Sheila, let me know if we're okay on time, by the way.
We're good on time.
Okay, so I've got this storage account, and in the storage account, I've got some blobs. And so I can browse these blobs even in the portal, which is pretty cool, right? So I've got these blobs, and I've got these containers, and one of the containers is called sample data. And in the sample data container, I've got this file. And notice the access tier is cool, okay? So this particular blob is sitting in the cool access tier. What I want to point out is that the decision about what tier data is sitting in is not a storage account level decision with these V2 storage accounts. It's actually a blob level decision, and I'll show you what that looks like. So if I go to the blob properties, you'll see here that the blob access tier is set to cool. Let's say that I now expect that I'm going to be reading and writing from this file a lot, and I want to bring it up to the hot tier. I hit change the blob tier to hot, I save, and that actually moves the blob from cool to hot storage. And this may make more sense if I'm going to be intensely using this. Maybe this has sat in the cool tier for a year, and now I've got a project that's going to start using it again, so I'll bring this up to the hot tier so that I'm not dinged on the read-write as much as I would be in the cool tier. So we'll let that change take effect, and then we'll be able to see that switch to the hot tier. See how now it's in the hot tier? Now, Manuel, that's great that you can do that, but I'm not going to click through 300 million blobs and change them from one tier to the other. I get it. Obviously, third-party solutions like the backup solutions we mentioned have the APIs to be able to call these changes to individual blobs based on your retention and usage scenarios, right? But just to point out, here's a logic app I created, and a pretty straightforward, simple logic app that goes through and goes to that same storage count, right? And if I look at what my logic app looks like, and I didn't write a single line of code to this, I can go in and create in the logic app designer every recurring job that recurs every single day, right? So if I look at the recurrence, it runs every day. Anything older than, in my test scenario, anything older than 1 day, okay, in this storage account, archive demo, in this container called logic app tiering demo, go through and change the blob tier to archive. So for example, there's a situation where I've got some solution or researcher writing data into a blob, into blobs into a storage account in a particular container, and I've got a serverless logic app that goes through and runs every day and says, hey man, if anything that's older than this amount of days, 1 day, move it from whatever tier it's at into the archive tier. And that would be, for example, long-term retention for legal purposes. And this is something where, even if I was building something in-house, I can use Azure Storage to go and do some pretty flexible things. And the fact that we have per blob tiering is very, very powerful because I can now mix and match data across the 3 different tiers in a single storage account. So that's it for the demo. And I'll flip back over to the deck for you, Sheila, so you can keep going.
Wonderful. Thank you. And again, like you can tell, Azure Storage is very versatile, different use cases. Most of the times it's meant just preliminary for long-term retention or just overall storage. But if you have any third-party backup providers, that's a great place to get started. While we're flipping over to... There we go. And while we're flipping over to the next slide, we can also shift this conversation from what we call cloud storage or Azure storage to Azure backup. And again, while storage is needed for backup, we do want to differentiate when we're using that term cloud backup because that is different from what we're calling cloud storage. Cloud storage is great because it gives you that ability to store your data in the cloud, and it's essentially a disk in the cloud. And even if that cloud storage is resilient, so let's say geo-redundant and gives you 6 copies, that's not going to be the same as cloud backup. Redundancy is great, but again, if you do, let's say, have an accidental deletion of data, or you need that point-in-time recovery or long-term retention, that's where that service, Azure Backup, comes into play. Some of you have a backup solution. That's great. You can continue using that and link into Azure Storage. But if you don't, we do also have different ways to use Azure for backup. And there's different use cases for this. If it's currently difficult to scale solutions to account for data explosion, if your tape archives are too expensive and difficult to maintain, or even if retrieval of offsite tapes adds to delays to recovery or meeting data compliance requirements, having Azure Backup is necessary and having that business continuity discussion. And the reason why we like to say this works in EDU is because I think everyone on this call probably could use some time back just in terms of managing Azure or just managing backup today. And I like to bring in two examples. One is just with overall backup and tape, and two with an actual use case on what happened when, let's say, something does compromise your data. So usually when people think backup and disaster recovery, the first thing that pops into mind is natural disasters like hurricanes or snowstorms, but that's not always the case. A lot of the times downtime is due to a hardware and software failure or just human error. And narrowing it in education, a couple of years ago, we had a large university that lost a bunch of backup tapes containing personal information on clients in a legal clinic. And according to that newspaper and what we heard later, that tape was lost by a technician who was transporting it on a local subway. And granted, the tape was coming from a local office, but it's just one of those things that can happen in transport to offsite storage. This is just an example, probably a little bit more of a dramatic one at that. But why not back up your data in a way that's more scalable and in a way that can give you more assurance that your data is actually safe? That's where we have our Azure Backup as a Service. So I think hopefully some of you have a couple of ideas on why cloud backup is handy and great for restoring data. And you can use this for a couple of different scenarios. If you just want to use an Azure, you can actually back up Azure IaaS VMs or even just SQL Azure for PaaS. Or if you want to look at a very hybrid approach, you can look at on-prem hybrid scenarios or look at long-term retention or just remote off-site backups. But what we want to say is, here is an approach, let's simplify this, where you can work directly with Microsoft and deliver you a full-out solution. So that way, you don't have to maintain any infrastructure. That results in minimal maintenance on your end for the backup solution. And at the same time, even though it's very simple, you still get that intelligence that you would need for backup data, like item level restore from the cloud, or just overall enabling you to achieve true cloud and global scale. And that helps from both just a management perspective and cost perspective. And a lot of the times, due to business or compliance reasons, education institutions are required to protect your data for years. And over time, this data is going to grow exponentially. Traditionally, tape's been a good way for long-term retention and backup, but backup provides a really compelling alternative to tape and disk, especially when you're looking at the cloud, because you still get those cost savings, but you also get a shorter recovery time. And while we're going through this high level, how you want to implement Azure Backup is going to depend ultimately on what you want to back up, your policies around backup, and how you see your overall backup vision compared to what you're doing now. But there's also just more built-in features while we're continuing to improve on the product, like compression and encryption and longer retention that you'll see in Manuel's demo. But just know we have all of these solutions for Azure Backup, and even though it seems fairly simple, it's pretty robust, I think, to what most folks are doing, or it's a little bit more secure and safe to at least transporting stuff on the train, for example. And I think our billing model also just reflects this. So for this, you still see an unlimited scale to, let's say, figure out what you want to do for backup in Azure Storage. So let's say you're going to plan for backing up 7 instances or 7 machines, and you only back up 5. That's fine. You're only going to pay for backing up those 5. So what's good here is that the two big costs are going to be, one, the cost for the machine, and that's going to depend on the tier that it's at in terms of size. And the second is storage, and that's going to be pretty familiar. And that, again, that's going to depend on, do you want it locally redundant, so 3 copies, or geo-redundant, which is 6 copies. But there will be no cost for restores or outbound bandwidth or just storage transactions in general. So again, pricing model for this is just fairly straightforward, but if you decide you want to change and don't want to use Azure Backup anymore, that's perfectly fine. You don't need to let us know. You could just turn it off in the Azure portal. So with that said, Manuel, I'll pass it back to you if you want to go through either a couple of scenarios of Azure Backup or one that you see a lot.
Yeah, and so I think one that tends to be unfortunately top of mind with my education customers is scenarios around, unfortunately, crypto locker. So what I'm going to do is do an Azure Backup kind of client view. So I'm going to run the Azure Backup Azure Backup agent here for you. So this is the scenario that Sheila showed on the previous slide, where we've got a backup occurring directly from the source system. It could be a file server. It could be an executive's endpoint. This is actually my own laptop that I use docked at home when I'm not traveling, and this is actually being backed up directly to Azure Backup. I have the ability when I install this to use an encryption key to encrypt the data as it sits in Azure Backup. So even if Microsoft gets subpoenaed and loses the court battle and has to turn data over to a third party, to the government, this data will be encrypted with a key that you, the customer, owns. And so here's a scenario just to give you an idea of what the backup scenario looks like. If I go to the properties of the backup, we'll take a look at what the options are, right? So you have here for options for the passphrase and encryption, right? I can use a proxy if I need to get out. And the point that I want to make here is the protocol being used here is HTTPS with TLS. So we don't need a VPN tunnel, right, to pass this through a private network. We can use your connectivity, and I assume many of you are Internet 2 members. We have private peering with Internet 2 to the tune of 60 gigabits, and very high performance and high bandwidth investments that our customers have already made that we can leverage. If you need to throttle this, you can also throttle, enable bandwidth throttling, which I have enabled. And to say, hey, during work hours, only use a half a megabit. Outside of that, you can raise that up to much higher amounts. And I have the schedule kind of set up to protect my backups from not, affecting my calls, right, that I might be having during the day. And so that's pretty cool. And so if we want to go ahead and take a look at a recovery scenario, let me show you what that looks like. So let's do a recover data. So I'm going to recover data from a backup that was done on this system. And so let me pull out individual files and folders, and I want to show you how quickly we can get productive in the event that the data was either lost or cryptoed. So I'm only backing up the C volume. So now we're going out to Azure and looking at what are the recovery points that are in the catalog for the C volume of this system. And I'm doing a pretty constrained backup to just kind of my documents, right, in this particular scenario. But what's powerful that I want to show, and I'll bring up, let me bring up the iSCSI initiator as well while that's loading up. I want to show you guys really, and those of you that know what an iSCSI initiator is, you're probably already thinking ahead. It's really, really cool how we go ahead and mount the backup catalog for you to be able to go ahead and pull out data. The way we do that is if it's a Windows or Linux client, we can actually go through and mount that as a volume. So let me bring up also my computer. And this is actually kind of cool, so you can see this. So I'll bring up my computer. And we'll show this PC. Let me bring this window over here so you guys can see it. Okay, so I've got this PC, and notice that I've got this single OS disk on my system right now, right? Just one volume. So I come in here and I say, okay, you know what? I want to recover from, let's say, yesterday's backup at 12:30 p.m., and I want to go ahead and mount that. So this is actually executing a command that's going to do an iSCSI mount across the internet, okay, from my client out to Azure, and we're going to go ahead and see that connecting here, and we will mount a disk that is the actual backup set directly on my system. And assuming the demo gods are with me, and they were with me yesterday, my connectivity's good, we'll be able to see actual, instantaneous access to my files so that I can get productive. So you notice how I have another local disk, D, attached to my system now. That's the iSCSI mounted. You can see we're connected here in the iSCSI connector. Sorry, in the iSCSI initiator. I've actually got a volume here now that I can browse. So I'm going to wait for this to come back. It's already in the process of mounting this. Should be another few seconds. And then I'll be able to actually go to that D volume and pull back the files that were part of my backup set. Again, this is coming from the cloud, and I'm pulling it down on demand. So it's not like I have to
Hey folks, did I lose audio or is it just me?
I think it's him.
Okay, got it.
All right.
Just want to double check it wasn't me. Good to hear someone else.
Yeah, we lost voice in presentation.
All right, it looks like he is getting back now. He should be on in a couple of minutes. That's what happens when we anger the demo gods in some way or another, or joke about connectivity. That's exactly it.
Just mentioned that.
I know, it's always good timing. Perfect. But while Josh and I are on the phone, we wait for Manuel to get his demo back. Any questions about backup or storage so far? Josh, are you still on? All right, so we'll wait on recapping that NYS Azure contract. We'll wait for Josh to get back on, so I can go ahead and get that ingress and egress charge when restoring backup. So again, no charge for restores when it comes to backup. And I don't know if folks have seen the Azure pricing calculator, but the majority of your costs are going to come from, and I'll put this in the window, from the size of the machine and the amount of storage, but you won't see, just in general, any restore data from that. The only time you would actually see restore data is if you're just plain old using Azure Storage and you're linking that to a third party. There you go. That help to answer, Sridhar? Perfect. Sounds good. And just so folks know, out of your education contract, the good thing is if you're purchasing on an EA or EES, you actually get, in general, your egress waived. So ingress is always free. We love it when you put data into Azure. But let's say you're moving data out. Usually there's a cost for that. But if, let's say, that total amount of egress is 15% or less of your bill, you won't be paying egress charges. Most of the time, it's around 1%. Your compute and storage and backup is going to be the majority of it. So it's very rare that we do see egress charges on there. But just know if you do want to start planning for egress, you probably won't see any on your bill because it'll be waived if you are on an EES. Now it's just extra info, and Manuel is getting back on the phone now. But any other questions around backup or disaster recovery? Or any use cases that folks want to go through while Manuel's logging on. We can do, let's see, Azure IS backup or just general services. Don't feel like you have to limit it to Windows. If later on you also want to learn just in general about, let's say, how VMware works with Azure or how Linux works with Azure, we can go over that too. And Manuel, can you hear us okay?
Hey, I'm back. I apologize. I had a Comcast outage there. That was odd, so I apologize. Sheila, would you like me to just get through the last step there in the demo, browsing the files? It looks like my iSCSI volume stayed mounted through that outage, which is cool.
Go for it.
Okay, I'm going to try to reshare my desktop here, and hopefully the connectivity gods are with us here.
Someone said you angered the demo gods, so
I think I may have angered them. Let me know when you can see my screen, Sheila.
I see it.
Okay, good deal. So I apologize, folks. I literally had total connectivity blackout there, right as we were getting to the good part of the demo, so I apologize for that. So we have, now it says, okay, the recovery volume is available till this time. You can have up to 24 hours to look at it if you're doing an ongoing copy. If I hit browse, it's going to open up the D volume. And so, actually popped up in another window here. Let me just bring that over. Just go here. D. Of course, with the connectivity interruption, this may take a moment to see if this guy is still showing connected. This guy's the initiator. Yep, through the connectivity blackout. So we'll bring this over and let this come up. The idea here is that I'll be able to browse the file system, right, and then pull out any of the documents that I have gone ahead and backed up, for example, because I'm backing up my local documents folder. Of course, I've never quite had a connectivity blackout during one of these demos, so hopefully this Explorer responds here.
Are folks still able to see Manuel's screen? Manuel, I can see your screen okay, but let's see, someone may have an issue. Let me see. Can someone else say, are you seeing Manuel's screen or not? Okay, someone is.
Yeah, Dave says he sees it, yeah.
Yeah. All right, a couple folks can see it. So if you can't see it, I would just try minimizing and maximizing the screen, or just try logging back out and logging back in again.
Side note, while that's loading up, I see a question in the chat window about OGS and New York State Azure contract. All the Azure SKUs are on the OGS contract. You can do it a couple different ways. So there's a few different ways you can purchase. You don't actually have to, like your Microsoft licensing, you don't need to reach out and say, oh, we want to do this specific workload, we need to pay X, Y, Z. I think Sheila spoke about it a little bit at the beginning, but you almost purchase it like you could do it two different ways. You could do it. Sheila, did you go over this? Remind me.
No, I didn't go over it. I was planning on going over it at the end. So you are ahead of me, and you can go over it now if you want.
No. We'll do it at the end. I'll just say that everything within Azure is included in the OGS contract, approved on the OGS contract at this time. And then we can go over the logistics at the end. I hope that's helpful.
And I apologize, folks. It looks like this lack of connectivity has caused Windows Explorer to not be happy trying to browse this local disk. It does show mounted. If I look at the devices, it looks like that connectivity disruption caused us a little bit of a headache in the demo here. So I apologize for that demo fail. Hopefully that's the only demo fail we have during the duration of the call, and my only disconnectivity during the duration of the call. But we'll jump back to Sheila's slides. One other thing I'll note is backup retention can be up to 99 years, right? So in the state of Florida, for example, we've got the Sunshine Law, where public institutions in the state of Florida have to retain in-scope electronic records for 7 years, and any citizen can request discovery against that, which is lots of fun. But so this is a scenario in which retaining 7 years worth of tapes can be interesting because of challenges around can I even read the tapes, etc. One of the important things to note about Azure services is that they're evergreen from a hardware perspective. Microsoft is the one maintaining the data, the volumes, etc., and the technology behind the scenes is not your headache, so to speak. We just have an SLA on being able to access the data. And speaking of accessing the data, we now have responsive Explorer. So before we jump back to the slide, Sheila, just real quick, I know we lost a couple minutes here. I just want to try to get to the idea of the demo, right? So I'm now looking at the user's mgrega folder, and I'm actually live browsing this across the internet while I'm doing the Skype call on my Comcast connectivity, which hopefully is not too slow. We have this documents folder. And again, this is from 12:30 p.m. Just after lunch yesterday. My backup synchronization point. One important thing to note is this is continuous data protection. So there's not a concept of procuring fools. What we're doing with the backup agent here is just grabbing whatever has changed since the last backup, so it's super efficient from that perspective. Of course, it compresses and dedupes before it sends it across the wire, so it's super efficient, and I love it, particularly for road warrior machines. A lot of my education customers may have departmental file servers, these kind of scenarios where, yeah, you're moving to OneDrive, or if you must, Google Drive, whatever. But you're moving to cloud storage, you're moving users to that, but you still have a lot of file shares. Those file shares need to be backed up, and so it's an interesting scenario to be able to say, hey, look, I'll have essentially continuous incrementals. I can restore from any point in time, and I have retention up to 99 years, and do this all in the cloud. So I'm not handling tapes. I'm not worrying about whether that data is encrypted across the wire, because it is via TLS, and I can even have my own encryption key if I require it. One of the important thing I'll note about Azure Storage in general is that, to Sheila's point about encryption, Azure Storage, all types of storage now by default are encrypted using server-side encryption, and so this is, you guys know that the the newer generations of hard drives and SSDs support using encryption for at-rest storage, and so this is enabled by default now in storage accounts, and actually I can show you what that looks like. It can help tick the box on a lot of different encryption requirements. So let me jump back into here, and I'll show you on the storage account that I created with you guys in the earlier step. We'll see that server-side encryption, and of course, yeah, I realized that it was interrupted. Server-side encryption is actually enabled by default, and so it's an important thing to note, for you all when you're having that compliance conversation around what's, how your data is stored in the public cloud. That with Azure, it's encrypted on disk at rest. Of course, we have significant processes and third-party attested processes around how we dispose of old hardware, so that there's never any circumstance in which one of a customer drives that contain customer data appear on eBay, right? One of those things that we have concerns about when we recycle equipment on premises in our private cloud. However, even if something like that were to occur, the fact is that the storage would be encrypted, and therefore, I'm not sure why I'm having an issue with Portal. Sheila, are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So something's going on with my connectivity, so I think we may pull away from demos for the moment and come back into the slides, and I'll let you go ahead and drive.
That is fine. Let me go ahead and request control now.
There you go.
All right, and while that's loading up, we just went through Azure Storage, we went through Azure Backup, and that's great for, again, business continuity and helping to start build your overall BCDR strategy. But the last and kind of one of the most important parts of this is also just capturing what happens for your overall disaster recovery strategy. So at least in education, this is probably very similar to your storage and backup trends. But unlike backup concerns, which are more concerned around protecting you against data loss, disaster recovery is really around the idea of protecting you against the outage of data centers or just the entire site. So DR technologies have been traditionally really expensive because either they required you to pay a high capex to operate a secondary disaster recovery center, or just that replication technology and high-speed network link was really expensive, or just overall it was hard to maintain and recover, and that process probably took either a full day or a couple of days rather than a seconds or a couple of minutes like you would like it to. And within DR also just comes other issues such as compliance assurance, making sure you're not impacting production workloads, and also just can you fail back and test out the scenario whenever you need to, in case you do want to test out what would happen if there was a huge snowstorm. So with this, but we see a lot of times right now the cost of maintaining a current DR solution without the cloud is very expensive, and what happens is either as a result you don't have a DR solution at all, or you just have a couple of solutions that are protected and the rest are probably let's plan and see what happens if a DR scenario actually does need to be triggered. This is where we can come and help with Azure. We have a cloud-based disaster recovery solution called Azure Site Recovery. And the purpose of ASR, or Azure Site Recovery, is to protect you from, or protect an on-premise server by duplicating it to Azure, or even another data center if you'd like to. So that's so if there's a disaster of some sort, let's say, again, a hardware failure or there's something wrong on-prem, you can turn on a duplicate virtual machine in a very short period of time and have little downtime during a disaster. That source, and you can kind of see on this table, it could be Hyper-V, VMware, or just a regular bare metal server. And that destination of where you duplicate that server could be Azure or just another second data center that you own. So again, during normal operations, meaning when there's no disaster happening, all that's essentially happening is the Azure Site Recovery service is duplicating that existing server. It's replicated very frequently. You can define that schedule. But again, there's no virtual machine running in Azure. You're just replicating those changed blocks of hard drives up into Azure. And during that setup, you can define what type of virtual machine you'd like, whether it's a smaller size or a larger size. But again, during normal operations, no virtual machine actually running. And if something were to happen, you could just spin up that replicated version in Azure. And the result is that you'll only be down for a couple of minutes rather than probably days and weeks with typical DRaaS scenarios. So it tends to give you some peace of mind knowing your workloads are protected from disasters, while also making sure you don't have to go through the process of building and maintaining a secondary data center or just relying on backup. The good thing here is that it's cost effective. Again, what you're doing is during normal operations, you're just replicating data. So what you have right now is if you want to replicate up into Azure, it's $25 per machine, which is very cost effective. One thing to note there is that you'll also see storage costs, but again, storage will be pretty minimal compared to everything else that you're probably doing right now on-prem or not doing. So whenever you're calculating this in Azure Calculator, make sure that you're both including those replication charges and those storage costs. But what you don't need to include just yet is virtual machine costs, because again, you're not running those in Azure. But let's say you do want to see what would happen if you wanted to, let's say, run a virtual machine in Azure. You could actually say, you know what, I think I'm going to run this for 10 hours in Azure. And we end up having folks just use Azure Site Recovery and that replication service as almost a migration tool where they'd say, it's already on in Azure, it seems to be working in Azure, let's keep it running there. So you probably, for a typical DR scenario, won't need any virtual machine or compute charges, but if you want, feel free to budget it in if you need it. And with that said, Manuel, do you want to go through an ASR scenario, or do you want to leave it at no demos for now?
Well, I don't mind trying again, but I want to expand a little bit on this topic that you're talking about. So, you mentioned several different on-premises scenarios that we have here, but there's also scenarios that we have customers that are doing AWS to Azure replication as well, to have a multi-cloud strategy, right, for uber critical applications, as well as migrations. And so to note, what Sheila's talking about is the ability to have, should I take back control, Sheila?
Yep, go for it. And I just got you to there you go. And I just got you to the slide, so you're good to go.
All right, good. Perfect. And so it's also important to note that this is our first-party migration tool as well. And the way that it works is if you protect a given system and you stop protection within 31 days, then you don't get that monthly $25 charge. That only starts on the 32nd day, right? So the idea being here is, if what you're doing is a migration, then you can use Azure Site Recovery to protect the workload by replicating it to Azure Storage. You can do test failovers to validate that it works the way you expect it to, even have constituents kick tires on it, make sure that it looks right and feels right and performs right, and then decide to go ahead and do a failover. Another important note that we didn't talk about is this a roach motel where VMs check in but they can't check out? Well, that's not true. What we do support failback. So from both Hyper-V and VMware, you can fail over to Azure and fail back to on-premises. Furthermore, if you didn't lose your storage that was presented to your VMs on premises, so in other words, if the disaster did not take out your SAN, we can actually pick up the deltas from where we left off. So we don't have to reseed terabytes and terabytes of data from zero if you didn't lose your on-premises storage. We can pick up where we left off. So folks really like that kind of efficiency. Another real important thing to note is in steady state protection, let me drop back over here. In steady state protection, notice that even though it shows here a VPN connection and potential express route, during replication, we use commodity connectivity just like the backup scenario. So the target is storage in Azure. And remember I was talking about earlier, that's REST API. So your systems on premises that are replicating out only have to talk HTTPS to an Azure public endpoint, which means we can leverage your significant Internet 2 or commodity Internet connectivity to push this data out. The only time that we need a VPN in this scenario is if you failed over workload to Azure that's a line of business application that your users on premises have to access via trusted connectivity. Okay, we need a VPN for that, right? But that's not related to Azure Site Recovery or the replication. And the other modalities, if you're failing back to on-premises, well, then you need to target particular systems behind your firewall on-premises. And so for fail back and reseeding of the replication back, we do need to talk over a VPN. So to be clear, steady state protection, no VPN required. We can use your heavy connectivity investments you've already made in Internet and Internet 2 connectivity. And then for failback scenarios, sure, we're going to need a VPN tunnel because we're going to need to push data back into systems on premises behind your firewall. So that's, I think it's a very interesting scenario for customers around just how easy it is to use Azure Site Recovery. So let me try here, see if we can get the Azure portal to behave a little bit better here. So let me pop a new browser window here and see if maybe we'll have a little bit better luck here. Let's do this. And I apologize, guys, that connectivity snafu really sent me for a loop. Hopefully we'll have a good experience here in Edge. Good deal. Yeah, looks like we're good. Okay, so I've got an Azure Site Recovery scenario set up protecting what a physical server protection scenario, which is 98% the same as the VMware protection scenario. Presuming that most of the folks on the call are probably running VMware in their private cloud. And okay, let's see here. Come on, browser. This is kind of unusual. I'm not sure if this is. Let's bring up.
Do you want me to call Comcast for you and lay down the law?
I know it's very odd because my Skype call is up. Let's see if we try IE and see if IE has a different story to tell. Because this is kind of odd. It's almost like a hung session. I apologize, folks. I got some kind of a strange connectivity snafu going on. So we'll go all the way back to good old IE and see what happens with IE. And so in this protection scenario, if I can get to the portal, what's powerful is the ability to do this steady state protection and continuous replication from on-premises into the cloud storage. And the idea is you create a run book, both GUI tools in the portal as well as PowerShell if you need it to do finer points, things like change load balancer configurations, verify that services are up before moving to the next layer. And you can set up multi-tier orchestrations for this failover. So, when I think about when I used to work in the real world, these paper documents that we had for runbooks for failover exercises can now be codified in PowerShell scripts and commandlets, and here we go. Yeah, looks like we're getting there. The ability to have that be all automated and fully tested, so that when you do exercise your DR workbook and runbook, that's going to happen in a controlled and replicatable modality rather than human beings under duress trying to flip through papers and put key in passwords, etc. If I can just get, nope, okay. And I got to be honest with you. Let's see, let's try this again. I've got something I was monkeying around with different identities before this call, and I think it ended up killing my browser sessions here. Let's see if we can. And that's the wrong identity. Okay, let's do this. I apologize, folks. You get to see multi-factor authentication at work here. That's another good point.
By the way, it does translate over to the Azure portal. So if you already have an existing school or work login with Azure Active Directory, you can use those same credentials for Azure. And if you want to enable MFA to get extra secure, probably happening in Manuel right now, you can enable that too.
Yeah, and even this in private browser session is in use. Hold on, let me kill all of these. Let me kill all of these sessions. Oh, I'm so sorry, folks. I've got major session issues. So kill all these.
No worries, Manuel. We have a nice diagram in there too, just in case.
Yeah, we may need to flow to it. Oh, I'm so sad. Come on. I apologize, folks. Major demo bad luck today. All right, this is the correct window. So before you close this, buddy, let's take a look and see if we can go to, do you feel like responding, or are you going to not respond, my friend? Yeah, I think we're going to have to bail out of all these browser windows. Okay. Okay, I should have killed all sessions now. Let's see if we can get. What we're looking for now. Okay, folks, I apologize. So it is worth getting to there if we can get there. Okay, so we're going to do Microsoft. Microsoft, yes. Come on. I think we're almost there. The other thing that's interesting is that Microsoft employees, you'll notice that we have ms.portal.azure.com that we're automatically redirected to. The truth is that we dog food new stuff. And sometimes we don't even know that we're using new stuff because we're actually using a alternate universe, so to speak, view of new stuff that's being pushed out to the Azure portal before production users see it. So we don't have a choice. We're opted into that. So I don't think that was to blame, but you can just see that it's a parallel universe here at ms.portal.azure.com. All right, so I think I'm at the point where I can go ahead and do the demo we were hoping to do. So the way that you deploy a backup and site recovery scenario is by creating a recovery services vault. And we have both of those services bundled together on the portal management side, although they are priced separately and they are separate services. So you'll notice that I'm going into a recovery services vault in order to go ahead and look at this scenario. In my lab, I've got a Web Server 1 physical server that I'm replicating into Azure, and it's a little bit slow, but we'll go ahead and see if we can get the view of the recovery plan, so you can take a look what that looks like. So if I look at my recovery plans, I want to show you how we can set up the automated failover and orchestration, even if you have multiple servers and multiple steps in that failover. So if I come here to my recovery plan, see I've got a plan for Web Server 1. If I look at what that recovery plan looks like, I've got different servers in them, and I can do different type of steps, right? So if I come in here and I look at the settings for the recovery plan, I've got the ability to customize that recovery plan and look at, okay, what am I going to do here? For a failover event, I'm going to take one machine, right, which is the one machine that's in this group, in this replication group, and I'll go ahead and start the virtual machine. And then after starting the virtual machine, I can add additional steps, right? So for example, I've got a script that adds a public IP address and a network security group rule to this VM after it's failed over. Right? And these are PowerShell scripts, and I can pull them from a catalog of pre-written PowerShell scripts that I can kind of cheat from, right? Build off of instead of having to start from scratch. This is what I'm talking about when I say the run book that is often on paper for our customers. Our customers love being able to take that run book, and by the way, it includes things like manual steps, right? So if I want to add a step to this, let's say I go ahead and come in here and I say add an action. I can actually add a manual step as well. So even if I have to have a human being driven action, I can add a manual action to this and then have the operator sign off on this during a failover and say, okay, this was done. So it supports both automated steps as well as manual action steps in the failover. So if I come back over here, I want to show you on the actual replicated item, I'll show you this Web Server 1 configuration. So if I look at Web Server 1, once this comes up, we can see what its replication health is, when the last replica was, and I can see what is the default posture that it will be landed at in Azure. Because it's important to note that the virtual machine doesn't exist until you push failover or test failover. We're replicating again to storage, and we're going to go ahead and, of course, I got critical because I lost connectivity during this outage. But if I go ahead and look at the configuration of it, I can see here for compute and network in Azure, I'm picking where do I want this virtual machine to be created and at what size. Okay, so what resource group does it land in? What is the name of it when it gets created? What virtual machine size do I want when it gets created, right? Do I want it to use managed disk or not? What network does it land in? What subnet within that network? And even what IP address do I want it to have when it's created? So when we think about complex orchestrations of multiple tiers, multiple systems, we have customers that are doing over 1,000 VMs. replicated into Azure with failover, obviously very complex failover scripts. One other thing to note is we have unique licensing benefit for Windows servers in Azure that allows you to bring your license mobility for Windows Server licenses into Azure and pay the Linux rate for Windows VMs in Azure, and that's called hybrid use benefit. Azure Site Recovery fully supports this, so you can say, yes, I want hybrid use benefit, so that when these virtual machines are created by Site Recovery, they're tagged as, hey, the customer owns Windows Server licensing. Do not charge the customer to rent Windows Server because they own this already. It's a big boon for our education customers because as education customers, we pay less for Windows Server than commercial folks do, right? So it's definitely a good thing to have that. And so one thing I'll note that's very important to note is this ability to be able to do failover and test failover. So notice that in the failover scenario, I had specified what virtual network this is going to land in. When I choose a test failover, what I'm saying is I want to instantiate the failover process, but I would like the ability to go ahead and choose a different VNet. Now, a virtual network in Azure is important because maybe what I want to do is actually fail over a multi-tier application into a bubble, so to speak, a bubble where nobody else can see it. So think about the scenario here where I might actually want to rent a test environment rather than run a steady state test environment. When I worked in the real world, right, I had, for example, we had a hospital. We had a Kronos timekeeping system where the nurses and employees would punch in and out. Because it was a hospital, it's open 24/7, 365. There are no breaks. And so it was a very critical application to be able to handle time clocking. That application was 15 servers. And the test environment was 15 servers. When we think about the overhead from the IT perspective of managing and patching and updating and backing up production and now test, that's 30 servers. Well, if I had something like Azure Site Recovery, that's an application that I probably would be protecting with Azure Site Recovery for the value of failover capability. But one other thing that would be really cool is anytime I wanted to, I could go ahead and instantiate via test failover a replica of those 15 servers into a bubble. If I want to, I could let the vendor come in, punch through that bubble and RDP to the app servers and do their quarterly update. And then let the subject matter experts from the department that understand what Kronos is supposed to do, because I don't really know, I'm just the IT guy, let them go ahead and validate that Kronos website is working at the alternative URL and that it looks correct. And we could do this between Tuesday and Thursday, right? Rather than them doing what they typically did, was do this stuff on a Friday evening, Saturday evening, very late, not tell me anything, and then when something went sideways, I had to restore 15 production servers, right? So I love Azure Site Recovery for two reasons. First is what the value that it's sold on, which is site recovery, the ability to recover out of region for critical infrastructure. The other part that I love is the ability to rent a test environment that is faithful to production because it's a replica of production. And I cleave it off, and I go ahead and instantiate those and run my testing. To me, I think that's really, really powerful. So Sheila, that's probably about it for the demo stuff here. Is there anything else I should show, Sheila?
No, that's it. You are good to go.
All right, good deal. So I'll come back over to the PowerPoint, and I'll let you go ahead and take over.
All right, I'll go into request control. Oh,
I've got a funny message saying connecting, so I'm wondering if we lost screen share.
so I can still see your screen. I just can't request control for some reason.
Okay. Well, I can advance for you.
Yeah, that's fine. And then you can just go ahead and skip through the next couple slides. I had two notes in here, folks. So one thing was with Azure, again, we talked about Azure Storage, Azure Backup, Azure Site Recovery. But again, if you have a partner and you want to learn how they integrate with Azure, bring it to us. We have a couple of just folks listed on here. There's more that we didn't include, Veeam, Commvault, Veritas, and so on. So again, don't feel like you need to go through just our first-party solutions and providers. We're completely open. And then, on the next slide, we always get the question, right, about what do we do about identity in Azure? Is that something we should use Azure Site Recovery for, or what's the best way to essentially ensure that we won't be down, especially when folks need to start accessing those critical systems? So, Manuel, maybe do you want to take a minute or two and touch upon when folks would probably use Azure IaaS and what type of workloads they would use it for?
Right, and so it's a good point to think about. What does DR look like for I'll call ring zero services, right? Uber critical services. So when we think about higher education institutions, oftentimes that would be things like website, right? That's pretty important in a disaster event. Things like identity, right? So the ability to authenticate often to many cloud properties, right? So you may have Office 365 deployed, you may have Google Apps deployed, you may have an online LMS system, you may have an online student information system, more and more SaaS third-party providers, but they often have a reliance upon an identity provider like ADFS, like domain controllers. Shoot, you might have LDAP calls, right, going against domain controllers. You may have Shibboleth or JSIG CAS set up. And it's absolutely fine to replicate those with Azure Site Recovery and have a failover scenario. However, when we look at what it costs to run some of these VMs steady state in Azure and the ability that we have with global traffic management to actually have like a hot load balance scenario, many of our customers, actually the great majority of our customers, look at a Ring 0 service like identity and websites and say, you know what, those are things that I want to run steady state in Azure, perhaps not at full capacity, full load capacity, but I want it hot because I want to know that it's working, that it's load balanced and it's in there, and I would like to, sometimes, for example, a lot of my users might be remote, why would I push them through on-premises to on-premises ADFS servers or on-premises Shibboleth servers to authenticate to a cloud service? Why not allow them to go ahead and do all this off my pipes in Azure? And so we do see a lot of customers that are deploying ADFS, domain controllers in Azure, Shibboleth, CAS, other third-party identity providers in virtual machines in Azure because they want that zero downtime for failover because it's hot, and they would like to gain the benefit of being able to say, hey, particularly if my user is off campus, what sense does it make to push that authentication traffic on premises for a cloud property anyway? And so that's definitely low-hanging fruit.
Great, thanks, Manuel. And again, that goes through, I think, storage, backup, DR, what you can do if you already have existing infrastructure, but also maybe use cases where you'd want to look at Azure VMs. So really next stage here is how can we get started? So when we want to help you price out solutions, we'll obviously help you say, here's how much backup would potentially cost, here's how much disaster recovery costs, and so on. But the important thing to know on the next slide is when you actually do that purchase of Azure, you'd never go up to your Microsoft reseller and say, I want to recover 5 machines. They probably won't give you a quote for that. But essentially what you say is, I want to purchase this much of Azure. And what's good there is that it works like a bank account. What happens is, let's say you purchase $1,300 of Azure, $10,000 of Azure, you can use that towards whatever Azure service you want. If you want to start up with backup and DR and then change that over to, let's just say, storage, perfectly fine. You don't need to let me know. You don't need to let Josh know. You could just flip those services over within your Azure portal. So as you start to consume those Azure services, like virtual machines and storage and so on, it gets deducted from that initial bank balance or commit that you put forward. And mostly all Azure services are included in that commit that you'll be negotiating with your reseller, except for anything that's per user, like an Azure Active Directory. So let's say you commit $10,000 and then you end up going over. That's perfectly fine. We won't shut off your services. We're going to assume that they're all production. So what happens is you'll get an invoice and you can get a notification too that says you're over, you're going to pay this in 3 months, and then you'll get a bill to pay back what you owe. So I know we kind of use the analogy of bank account, but there's no fee associated with going over. You just pay back what you owe. So that's essentially how you get started with Azure. Best way to get the most effective pricing is to purchase from your reseller or your Microsoft partner. Josh can help you get connected to the right person if you currently do not have Azure today. But again, I'd look at least seeing what you need, how much it's going to cost you in Azure. It's something we can help out with. We also have our handy calculator that I put in the IM window, and commit that amount. Or if you want, you can just get started, say you want the minimum amount of Azure, and just start using Azure from there and using that as your initial sandbox. Josh, did I miss anything?
The one thing maybe to consider that I didn't hear us mention is, so central IT at a lot of the universities and colleges that we support, they have different departments that they might want to bill back to. Can you speak a little bit to Cloudin and how we can use this as a service across a campus?
Yeah, that is a great point, Josh. Thanks for bringing that up. So, folks, if you weren't aware, initially when we first look at Azure management, it's very hierarchical, where you can have different roles and enable roles-based access control where you can control who sees what. So if I wanted to add Josh as, let's say, a department admin as, let's say, School of Medicine, he can only see what's happening under him, but he can't see what's happening, let's say, with the School of Law. But recently what we did is we acquired a company called Cloudin, and now we're merging that with the full name, Azure Cost Management. And that really helps schools and education institutions get full visibility into what everyone's using. Also enable that same type of role-based access control. But what's really good there is you can start to divide up billing and get more clarity on showback. So let's say you want to actually just maybe say, I want to get a soft quote on Josh for $2,000. And for Manuel, I want to get a soft quote of $3,000, and I want to see exactly what they're using. You can actually separate out those costs within the cost management portal, which is great. And something that's handy, which I just found out a week ago, is let's say they're not using their services. It'll tell you what machines they're running are currently underallocated, or what machines they should be turning off at night, or maybe just upgrading to a further machine. So we initially started with just basic roles control, but now you get full visibility, and that will help you with showback and chargeback and just overall management. Miss anything, Josh?
No, that's a really good way to say it, and that enables a lot of larger universities and higher education institutions that we support to provide services to departments across campus without having to wait on hardware to arrive, get it fired up, find rack space, calculate the heating and cooling, all the different aspects of your business, and simplifies it. And then when you're done with it, I've been to some institutions that when they're done with hardware, they just throw it in a room, literally throw it in a room because they don't have space for it. So that's a waste of resources versus with Azure, you turn it off and you're not spending any money on it anymore. So I think it's a really great use case.
Well, and Josh, along those lines, I remember, painting over purchasing decisions, right? If I'm going to drop $1 million into SAN storage and a bunch of blades, I'm stuck with that decision for multiple fiscal years, right? I mean, that's spend that has to address that. Furthermore, think about it. 1 year after I purchased it, it's no longer the bright, shiny object it was when I purchased it. The market has moved forward, right? Moore's Law is beating me over the head because if I would have taken that $1 million and spent it 12 months later, I could have gotten 40% better performance and density. Maybe, right? Somewhere in there, 35, 40% more. When we think about public cloud, what's powerful is you're spending the dollars in real time. And the provider is the one upgrading the infrastructure. So the containers that Sheila showed at the top of the call, those containers get swapped out with newer generation devices. Costs go down, not up. And yet the throughput, the performance, the density is higher. And so it's really interesting when we think about the CapEx versus OpEx model. When I have the CapEx model, I'm buying something with, understood, I've got a set amount of budget. It's got to last me 5 years. And let's be honest, folks, in the DR scenario, I'm probably sending the old gear after it's 5 years old to the colo facility and praying and hoping that when it's 7 and 8 years old, it still works. Right? And a lot of us do that. Right? I remember I did that. Not the best scenario. If instead I can take my dollars and rent the latest generation of equipment at a very attractive rate from a provider who's constantly refreshing it, I'm broken free from that, kind of loss scenario where my capital expenditures are devalued by 100, at the end it's 100% devalued at the end of 4 years, 5 years, whatever my warranty purchase was. It has no value. And so it's very interesting to think about that, along the lines of what Josh was talking about is saying, hey, if I can switch this to an OpEx kind of scenario, I can get high performance all the time. And my dollar goes further year over year instead of less.
Can you tell me where you're getting $1 million to spend on all that stuff? Just kidding. No, thank you. That's great. That's a great point, and really shows how you can be a little more flexible with your technology instead of committing to it long term. So that's a great point. Is there any? We have 6 minutes left. Is there any other questions that anybody would like to come off mute or drop in the IM window? Another thing to mention, we've had a lot of folks joining these calls. Feel free to drop, any of us on the call a note. And what we can do is, in the case you have interest in other workloads within Azure, if you have specific use cases, let us know, and we'll include that as a topic in a future call. And a lot of times that will impact across SUNY. So let us know what helps you, and we'd be glad to provide you with those resources.
Yeah, and folks, just so you know, if you already have Azure, we have a couple of really good promotions going on. So Manuel, do you mind going to the next slide?
Not at all. I was trying to bring up the documents from my earlier failed demo.
No worries. Well, for folks that already have Azure, there's 3 offers that if I were you, I'd definitely be taking advantage of. One, I think folks, if you have Azure, you know about it, you get 1 hour free with their Azure Ops team, and they'll help you through Azure Management 101. So how can you leverage the cost management tool? How can you view billing? How can you set permissions, etc.? Always been available, always complimentary. If you need help signing up, just contact Josh. Second is Azure Fast Track, and that's been fairly new. So this is really great for guidance or making sure you're getting set up correctly. So if you want to do a test failover, make sure you're doing all your good considerations for storage and backup, our engineering team will actually provide best practices and guidance, plus monthly check-ins to make sure that, at least from your side and from their guidance, that you're getting set up correctly. And the last is, if you just want to get started in Azure and have a partner or premier service come in and do stuff for you, and you have the option to be on site with them, you got that option too. So with Azure Fast Track and that Azure partner offering, those are first come, first serve. I think we're almost done and running out. But if you have immediate interest to get started on your current Azure, yes, contact Josh and we can make sure you are getting connected to these current offerings. And if you don't have Azure, that's perfectly fine. We have great scenarios for you to get started. Contact your reseller, loop in Josh if you need help. But also, if you need an assessment on maybe what to move to Azure, we also provide different assessment and migration tools to help you out too. So yes, we can share this deck and we'll share more info about these offerings too, so you can take advantage ASAP.
I apologize, but I've got to show it. So finally, I was able to open up the Excel spreadsheet that I really needed for my meeting, based on my earlier demo that was very, very severely affected by my connectivity issues. But the point is, I was able to open my file I really needed post failure or crypto or whatever the issue was out of that backup. So apologize for all the connectivity issues, but we finally got the data up. So, folks, I don't see a lot of questions. I would say one other thing to kind of plug, shameless plug for the Azure Hours. So, Josh, I don't know if this is something you've shared out with the group, but every Friday, starting in the new year, I think it's first week back, right? The 5th, we're going to be starting up again every Friday at 2 p.m. now Eastern. Ask anything of our Azure TSP and SSP team, and we've been having really, really good conversation. Customers coming up and asking anything. It's also interesting to hear what other customers are asking. So, shameless plug for that 2 p.m. Eastern time call.
I haven't shared that broadly, but I can. If anybody would like to be included in that, please drop me a note, and I'll forward it along.
Good deal.
Sheila, Manuel, thank you so much for your work. We really appreciate it. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to drop us a note. We'll be sharing. Bob, I saw your note. We'll share the PowerPoint with you. It's public, so we can send it right along to you. And then as additional follow-ups, the Azure Fast Track is a great resource, and our partner resources. Let us know what you're interested in, and we can help you get to the next level. And thanks again, everybody, for joining.
Have a great holiday, folks. Take care.